Good afternoon and welcome to this joint Conservative Home Joseph Rowntree Foundation event on a new generation of good jobs to secure an economic recovery from all of us. I'm just going to make a few introductory remarks and then I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one and then we'll have a discussion. I mean, just by way of introduction, three quick points. I mean, first, if the coronavirus hadn't happened, we'd doubtless still be having a meeting of this kind. First, to, I suppose, discuss micro policy, what government can do, I suppose, in particular from those who are furthest from the labour market. That would probably broaden into a discussion about macro policy and what the government and the Treasury can do on a bigger demand scale. But finally, of course, we have had the coronavirus. We're in the middle of trying to deal with it now. So this discussion takes place in that context. And the discussion about the people who are hardest to reach, furthest from the labour market, who may just have lost their jobs or come onto the labour market this year and may not have one, these are particularly challenging times. So without any more to do, I'm going to go to the first of our three panellists. And the bad news is that we've lost the Minister, Paul Scully, because through no fault of his own or anyone else's, he's got to go to the Commons this afternoon to answer an urgent question. And of course, the Commons comes first. But I'm delighted to say that at really no notice at all, Stephen Crabb has agreed to join us and participate in the panel. So we may not have a present Under Secretary of State, but we have a former Secretary of State. Furthermore, one who at work and pensions was right at the heart of some of the discussions that we'll be having this afternoon. So we have Stephen with us by audio at the moment. And Stephen, I know you've been thinking a lot about this anyway, because you were writing for us on ConservativeHome about universal credit and work only a few weeks ago. So why don't you tell us your thoughts about good jobs, a recovery and COVID?
Thank you very much, Paul. And firstly, apologies that we're having some difficulty with the video. We'll try and get that sorted, but I hope you can hear me okay. Your opening point there, Paul, about the need for a discussion around this, even if we hadn't been through the pandemic of the last 7 months, is absolutely correct. I remember sitting on a panel 12 months ago at the Physical Party conference in Manchester, talking about exactly this issue. And the point that I made that evening was that despite 10 years of enormous and remarkable jobs growth in the UK economy, with the UK economy generating enormous numbers of new opportunities for work, we were still wrestling with significant problem of underemployment, people not being able to get enough good work, people distant from the labour market, trying to overcome challenges in their lives that prevented them from making the most of the opportunities in front of them. And we were also talking 12 months ago about what I described then as almost the Achilles heel in what is nonetheless a relatively good story to tell about the UK economy under the Conservatives over the last 10 years, the Achilles heel being the growth of in-work poverty. And that runs right counter to our core narrative as Conservatives that work is a good thing. And Rishi Sunak in his speech earlier today was talking about the nobility of work. That's something as Conservatives we absolutely believe in. But one thing we have to be cognizant of, I think, is that despite this enormous growth in employment opportunities we've seen in the last 10 years, there's also been a rise in work poverty, and that should trouble us as Conservatives. And all of these things that I've just spoken about, what COVID has done is accelerated some of the key trends within the UK economy, within the labour market. It's also thrown in some other new developments as well around home working, and we can maybe talk about that later. But for me, what it has massively underlined is the need, first and foremost, for a decent welfare state that supports people when they find themselves in hardship, and the fact that staring us in the face right now is enormous numbers of jobs being lost. And again, that should trouble us as Conservatives, and is a real test for us, I think, as a government in terms of how we respond to this, how we put in place long-term support mechanisms to support families to help keep their heads above water, avoiding financial crisis, so that they can, when the economy recovers, take advantage of the new jobs that will hopefully be created, and the need for measures like Rishi has already announced around the Kickstart scheme to support young people in particular back into the labour market. And I fear that young people will be bearing one of the heaviest brunts of the economic fallout of COVID-19. So that's just by way of a general introduction, Paul, and we can get into the detail on any of those issues in the Q&A if you like.
We can, Stephen. Thank you once again for being with us. I know you've got to go at about 4:10. We're very grateful to have you at all, given the notice. I'm going to come next to Jonathan Gullis, who is, I suppose, an illustration of Conservative success in what I'm now, I think, meant to call the blue wall, but everyone else calls the red wall. I mean, this time last year, the Conservatives had no seats in Stoke. We hadn't had any seats in Stoke, time out of mind. And here's, well, that's not right, sorry, we had Stoke-on-Trent South, didn't we, Jack Brereton. But Jonathan's now the MP for Stoke-on-Trent North. We have all the Stoke seats. And Jonathan, I suppose you wouldn't have been elected if there wasn't dissatisfaction for a very, very long period in Stoke with Labour, who'd held your seat for time out of mind, in relation to a lot of things, also in relation to jobs. Anyway, you're very welcome, and please do give us a view now.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the opportunity. And I, as you said, a year ago today, I was in the classroom ahead of year and teaching. So I appreciate I'm not a business whiz, but I will certainly do my best to lay out the land of Stoke-on-Trent, which is, look, productivity in Stoke-on-Trent has increased in the last 10 years. But Stephen made the exact point that wages have actually decreased. Earnings of workers have gone down. The average Stoke-on-Trent person in a year earns £100 less a week than anyone else in the UK. So, you know, that need for good jobs, not just following the old traditions of mum and dad into the pot banks, because sadly those jobs aren't ever going to come back in the numbers they once were, and nor are those jobs sustainable for the long-term future as we go down the automation or technological situation. You've obviously got a city as well, tragically, that, you know, we are well below average in level 3 and 4 take-up qualifications. So that means that, you know, the real figure here is 12% of my workforce have no qualifications. That's 8% higher than the national average. So I've got a workforce that is going to be very vulnerable to the impact of COVID and was already vulnerable before COVID came along. So I suspect the problem is we were on the back foot and it feels like we've taken 10 steps back already. For me, to tackle this, it is the welfare state is important, but Stoke-on-Trent people don't expect a handout and nothing, you know, and somehow that will save the day. They're hardworking, honest people who love going to work and feeling that sense of pride. But it is about that shift in mindset and in culture about the type of job that you have. At the moment, we seem to have gone from the pot banks into the warehousing. What I want to do is the things that I've been calling for a Silicon Stoke. In Stoke-on-Trent, we have 104 kilometres of gigabit being installed, like a motorway being installed, that will be vendor neutral and owned by the city council. If we can build on that and actually create a video games industry, which I think we have Staffs Uni that are UK leaders in that regard, TV and film where it's already been successful, then there's opportunity for young people to see beyond the normal stereotypical jobs there and actually invigorate a city into creating a new identity for itself. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge that I accept gracefully. But it is going to be, it's a bleak market out there right now, and the welfare state is going to have to play a big role. And I think the biggest announcement of anything that's happened during this COVID crisis is the announcement that a level 3 course is now a right for anyone of any age to be able to take up, because that will unlock massively the potential and the opportunity for people in Stoke-on-Trent, Kidsgrove and Talk.
Jonathan, thank you very much. And I'm now going to turn to our co-sponsor of the event, Helen Barnard, who is the director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation.
Hi everyone, brilliant to be here and to be with such a distinguished panellist. We can now see everyone, which is lovely. So I think that the way you have all started is exactly right, that what we've seen through COVID is it has shone a light on both the strengths and the weaknesses of our economy. But also we are seeing the economic impacts fall most heavily on both the people and the places that were already struggling. Now, I think from policy terms, the government's initial economic response was bold, it was compassionate, it was incredibly effective in helping people weather this storm. So the job retention scheme, support for self-employed people, universal credit boost, that was, so much of what everybody wanted to see, and it was put in place really fast. Now, we were arguing that we should then have a targeted furlough scheme to follow on. So it was great to see the Chancellor announce the job support scheme. The design of it, though, I think my big concern is that I'm not sure it will do that much to protect the lowest paid workers who are at highest risk of losing their jobs in the coming waves of unemployment. So the work we've done looking at who is at risk of job loss, what we found is workers on the minimum wage, about 4 in 10, face a high or very high risk of job loss. If you then look at people who are paid £40,000 upwards, they only face a 1% risk that their jobs are going to go. So it's going to be very much the lowest paid who are on the forefront of taking this next wave. Now, the job support scheme, the way it's designed, it basically means that firms will be it will financially make a lot more sense for a firm to keep one person full-time than 2 people part-time. And what it means is that the only reason you would keep people on if you can't give them full-time hours is if you've invested enough in those people that you don't want to have to rehire and retrain them when the economy fully opens up. And what we've seen across Europe is that means that it incentivizes firms to keep on workers who are high skilled, that they've invested in, but it's not a great incentive to keep on a low paid, low skilled worker who's on an insecure contract anyway. So what that's going to mean is I think we have to accept there is going to be a big wave of job loss, and the focus has got to be on equipping people to get those new jobs and new opportunities as they come through. Now, I think, as you said, Jonathan, the investment in the skills, the investment in funding an A-level, level 3 course for anybody is a brilliant start, but by itself, it's not going to meet that coming wave. So in particular, we need to see more investment in basic skills. There are still millions of people who don't have the basic skills you need to even get close to that. But there are also a lot of people who have a level 3 qualification, but it's not one that's going to get them entry into the kind of jobs that Jonathan's talking about. So we also need to fill in that right to retrain that the manifesto promised. We need to bring that forward for those groups as well. The other thing I would say is the other side of this is investing in creating the new good jobs in those places. And we can do more for that through investing in things like social infrastructure, so sorting out adult social care funding, in bringing forward the energy efficiency commitments from the manifesto to create new green jobs, and incentivizing private sector firms to hire people. Now, the last thing I want to say is one thing that was really interesting is all 3 of the previous speakers highlighted the quality of jobs. And that's something I think we can learn from the previous recession and recovery, where the recovery focused on purely quantity of jobs, but not really quality. And that created weaknesses for coming into this pandemic. So I think a focus on jobs where people can get enough hours, they're decently paid, they've got some security. That is how we create a more productive economy, which will help us with debt consolidation down the road. It's also how we make work that reliable route out of poverty, which I think, as Stephen said, is so close to the hearts of conservative values.
Helen, thank you very much. I think Stephen has logged off in order to log on, in order to try and ensure we can see him as well as hear him, but I think he'll be back. In the meantime, I want to come straight back on this point of quality of jobs and actually ask rather a broad question. And I'm sure we're going to talk a lot this afternoon about the quality of jobs and about everything through the job retention scheme, through childcare to housing and so on. But although a general economic recovery wouldn't necessarily provide those jobs, because a rising tide doesn't always lift all boats, it's nonetheless the case that the kind of people we're talking about who need good quality jobs and have problems getting them, they won't be able to get that if there is not a general economic recovery. So I do just want at the start to get one question out of the way, which is just sort of starting with you, Jonathan. Test and track, as we're seeing from the news today, isn't working perfectly yet by any means. If it doesn't work, we face the prospect, if a vaccine doesn't come, of seemingly ceaseless lockdowns and let-ups going on and on without there being a sustainable recovery. Do you think the mood among your colleagues is for a sort of shift towards some sort of more voluntary system, like the Swedish system, which would arguably allow for a quicker and wider economic recovery?
Well, that's a really good question. And look, I am completely empathetic to the Swedish model and what they're doing there. I'm a low tax, small state conservative. And so you can imagine that all my ideology has been challenged throughout this crisis in terms of what I expect a government to do. But I do think that if we went down that route, we would be risking the lives of the elderly because quite simply, I don't think the scientists have said there's no evidence to suggest that herd immunity, as it's used or called in Sweden, has effectively taken place with the UK population, and that, in fact, that we would be risking many more lives. And that has to come first in this global health pandemic, is the lives and safety of individuals. The economy is, of course, important, and I think you can do measures that would speed up economic recovery. Now, I'm, as I say, a low tax guy, and I appreciate the Chancellor saying, but someone's got to foot the bill. I suppose if you take the mindset that this is a war debt, like we did in World War II, and we agreed to pay this off over 50 plus years, with interest rates as low as they are currently, if in fact negative in some cases, then you can take the hit. But it does rely obviously on the economy recovering, people going back to the shops in the numbers they did longer term, people going back to the cinema, people going back to the tourism and hospitality industry. And that's where I do worry that strategy may fall on its face. So I personally think that test and trace, yeah, look, it's not hitting 100%. We would like it to, but you've got to remember this system is set up very short notice and is achieving nearly 80% contacts with those people who have tested positive. Over 400,000 people now meeting that target. And in Stoke, we've got a regional test centre, 2 walk-in centres that are now being installed by the government, and we've got the county council and the city council working together to create additional capacity. So I do think that local areas are taking responsibility and people are getting used to the new normal. But what it does mean is that we have to improve demand. So I've got ceramics, I'm a tableware area. The Eat Out to Help Out scheme was the massive thing for ceramic tableware because their orders were around 10%. They went up to about 50 to 70%. It was a huge incentive. Now, obviously, we're suddenly saying that, you know, we're closing the pubs and restaurants at 10 p.m. That has caused a problem. What I need government is to drive demand by people being able to go out and not necessarily having to do lots of more of the job retention scheme. And I appreciate what Helen said about the job support scheme, by the way, that, you know, what is viable, there is a debate there in itself that needs to be explored and looked at. But I think that what we have to accept is that, you know, we can't save every job, and that is brutal, and that's not something I think any chancellor ever wants to say, but at least it's honest.
Helen, this question is probably a bit remote from what Joseph Rowntree do, because you do involve yourselves, of course you look at the macro picture, but you do involve yourselves very expertly in micro policy. But I mean, what do you feel about this big question of it's going to be impossible to provide any kind of recovery that will reach the hard to help if there's no recovery at all, and there won't be recovery at all if we carry on turning lockdown on and off and off and on?
I mean, I think you're right that if we want to create a better economy, then, and if we want to be able to deal with the finances, restoring economic growth has got to be a priority. But I think that I'm not convinced by the argument that there is as stark a trade-off as I think people sometimes say. I think the idea, so I think for a start, if you think about who is at risk from COVID, if you add up all the groups that are high risk, that is actually an enormous part of the population. Older people, disabled people, people with underlying health conditions and so on. So if you move to a stage where you basically say, well, those groups just have to opt out of things, that's actually quite a lot of the workforce. It's an enormous part of the consumer base. So creating a situation where people feel it is safe to go out, I think has to be part of this. And to be honest, I think the fact that it's been bumpy so far, I don't think we should throw up our hands and say, well, we clearly can't run a test and trace system as a nation. You know, I think we can. I think we just have to get it right quickly and then be able to start opening up again.
Stephen, you may have missed the first part of the question. I think from hearing the answers, you'll realise that I've opened very broad by asking, well, we're not going to have any recovery for the hard to reach at all if there's no recovery generally, and can we carry on locking down and then opening up like this? Should we be trying to follow the Swedish model?
Yeah, so I mean, there's an awful lot of commentary about this on social media and Twitter, and most of it from people who aren't scientists, from what I can tell. And I'm certainly not a scientist, and there's a large measure of trust that we have to put in the people who are running the scientific part of the government strategy. What concerns me right now, when I look at where the local lockdowns are happening in England and in Wales, they are happening, they've been put in place in some of the most deprived communities already. So if you like, the current state of play when it comes to where are the lockdowns right now as we sit here and speak, absolutely highlights some of the pre-existing divisions that we have in our society and in our country. And that, you know, reinforces the point that you make, that if we keep just going around and round using the same tools of restricting freedom, shutting down parts of the economy, the people who are going to suffer the most are the people most vulnerable. So, I mean, what am I trying to say here? I think that the government strategy will have to become more sophisticated, and that goes for governments all around the world. You know, we're not doing anything that's particularly different from most other countries. The kind of policy measures we've introduced are pretty much in the mainstream of developed large democracies. But they're pretty blunt tools nevertheless, and we're going to have to get far more sophisticated about this, because I think the idea that this will be done by Christmas or done in the next 6 months or whatever we might have heard from politicians in recent weeks, I just don't believe. I think this is going to be around for a long time to come, and we've got to find a way of living with it and functioning and seeing the kind of economic growth that we're all talking about.
Okay, Stephen, I'm come straight to you with the next question, because it relates to, I'm now moving from the big picture to something that's more micro, but very, very important. It relates to something you wrote on ConservativeHome recently. I mean, you came on our site to make the point that in his recent financial presentation, the Chancellor extended several measures that he'd announced to deal with the crisis. So, for example, he's allowed the payment date for VAT to go back. He's extended the repayment periods and dates for some loans. You made the point in your piece, and as far as I know, you're one of the few Conservatives to do it, that he should extend the universal credit £20 a week payment. So I'd just like you, before I turn to Helen and Jonathan on the same subject, to say something about that. I mean, why did you write that? And do you feel your colleagues are sufficiently across this aspect of the debate about what poorer people in work are going through at this time?
Yeah, so at the start of the pandemic, before it kicked in, the truth is that Britain's main rate of unemployment benefit had fallen to, in real terms, the kind of levels it was in the early 90s. And that's as a result of us having taken a deliberate policy choice 4 years ago as a government to squeeze benefits for working age families. We prioritized increasing the state pension for retired people over and above inflation levels. And we felt at the right time it was the right thing to do at a time when the labour market was generating lots and lots of jobs, and we were trying to encourage as many people as possible to take up work. Now, for a period when we are losing hundreds of thousands of jobs, when families are finding their household finances smashed to smithereens in some cases, where they're losing 2 incomes potentially, and then having to rely on the welfare state, many families will find and are finding that the kind of support we provide as that welfare safety net, actually, if we're being honest about it, is pretty thin. So when Rishi Sunak increased the main standard allowance rate of universal credit at the start of the pandemic by £20 per week, that was exactly the right thing to do, recognizing that we needed to bring more firepower into our welfare state. For me, I just feel that the idea that we would withdraw this after only 12 months, when there will be more people looking for work next April, I just think it's unconscionable. And I think politically, the optics of it would be terrible for us as a government, given that the focus that we placed on winning votes from low-income voters at the last election a year ago. Many of those are families where universal credit forms a significant part of their income. We absolutely don't want to be hurting people's finances, either from an economic point of view or from a political perspective, which is why I've been making this argument repeatedly that the government needs to commit to holding on to that increase. It's really, really important, Paul.
Helen, I know you'll have a lot of sympathy with that argument because Joseph Rowntree has been making it as well. So I just thought I'd try on you what Therese Coffey said about it this morning in her interview in the Financial Times. She said, I'm now quoting from the report, the increase had been a stopgap measure, but at a cost of 5.7 billion might not be, quote, the most effective way to protect the largest number of people. Other welfare options under discussion with the Treasury included focusing extra support on children or lengthening to 12 or 18 months, the 9-month grace period before applying the benefits cap. Yeah. You'll have seen that interview, I expect, or at least been briefed on it. What's your view on that?
So I don't think they're either or, and I think the other things she suggested are very good ideas, but will do something slightly different. I mean, I actually think it's interesting. I agree with Stephen. There is an incredibly strong moral and political case for keeping it. I also think actually the economic case is very strong. So if you imagine in April, none of us think the economy is going to be back to normal. We're going to be desperately trying to boost economic growth at that point. The idea that at that point, you take, it's 16 million people this would affect, that you take 16 million people and overnight you knock out from their income about £1,000 a year. You take that demand out of the economy. Now we know from a point of view of poverty, that would pull about 700,000 people into poverty, 500,000 down into deep poverty. And we also know from economics, so if you look at economic stimulus, putting money into targeted social security is many times more effective in driving economic demand than putting something into tax cuts, for instance. And that's because people on low incomes are spending their money on essentials. They have to. So they're spending their money immediately, they're spending it locally, so it goes straight into that demand. I think the other thing is the place aspect. So one thing that I'm quite worried about is that through this, one thing we've seen is people on higher incomes have almost been forced to save because you can't actually, if you're, if a lot of your money goes on leisure discretionary things, most of that hasn't been happening. So there's actually real pent up demand from people on higher incomes potentially. For people on lower incomes, even with that £20 boost, we've seen about 7 in 10 families on universal credit cutting back on essentials. We've seen the majority actually building up debt over this period because they still can't cover all the essentials. So the idea that you kind of take these families who are struggling with debt, who have already been having to miss meals, and then you knock out £1,000 a year of their income, and you do that in the places which are desperate for people to spend money locally, it seems to me economically, it would be an incredibly damaging thing to do at a point when we're trying to drive a recovery.
Jonathan, what's your experience of interacting with constituents on universal credit during the
yeah,
crisis?
no. So I'm very lucky that in my team, my office manager actually worked for the Citizens Advice Bureau for 18 plus years. So she's been a real driving light in my office in terms of teaching me and educating me around the issue, but also ensuring that we get people and the targeted help we can do as quickly as possible. I think the big issue is in somewhere like Stoke is when they're going to the Job Centre Plus, they're going and speaking with a work coach, or they haven't actually been face to face. They've been trying to do it virtually or over the phone, which has been, I think, a real challenge. But then what the issue comes from that is where is an opportunity, as Helen and Stephen have talked about before, reskilling, retraining. Now, in Stoke, there isn't that many places to go. I think that's a failing, in my personal opinion, of our LEP and our Chamber of Commerce for not driving enough business towards individuals. For example, I think the Kickstart scheme is a really exciting prospect and something I think government needs to look at making a longer term thing. You know, for places like Stoke, if you get a young person into a traineeship and show them the benefit of a good job, and then say, by the way, at the end of these 6 months, there's an apprenticeship down the line, and that would require business to be honest and invest in those type of jobs as well, then you could actually have a relationship with the Chamber of Commerce, the college and the local authority and the job centre, all driving people in that direction. But I appreciate that's for the younger end of the market. I think where Helen and Stephen have a really valid point, and something that I've got to be honest with you, I'm still yet to make my mind on where I land on this side of the coin, as it were. And I promise you, I'm not just saying that. If Stephen knows I'm an opinionated guy, I normally say where my bread is buttered. But on this, I'm in a catch-22 because there are lots of 50, 60-year-olds who would need to work anyway into their 70s, to be quite frank, because they won't have the pension that others would do due to their low incomes. They are not going to be easy, nor is it going to be possible to potentially engage them in reskilling, retraining, or finding new jobs. I remember my stepdad got made redundant from IBM, and it took him 2 years to finally find a job because he was, in his case, a higher earner, but actually he was an older guy, and a lot of people going, well, for the cost of your dad, we can get 3 young people starting up. So there's a real issue there, and I think that's going to be where it comes from. I do accept, by the way, the premise that in 2008, higher government spending on welfare at the time and more borrowing did stabilise the economy more than it did in, let's say, the Great Depression in the 1930s. My issue would be with the £20 uplift becoming a more longer-term thing is where would that money, could that money be spent on other schemes, more into further education colleges, more into work coaches? But again, like I say, it's something I need to read into before I really take a solid perspective on.
Just following up that point about universal credit, I'm just going to grab Stephen again because I know he has to go early and we're lucky to have him at all. This afternoon, we're going to have a long discussion, which is going to involve suggesting plenty of things that the government can do. But actually, it's just worth pausing for a moment, isn't it? Because universal credit has been a bit of a kind of unsung hero of the coronavirus crisis so far, in that while things other departments are doing haven't necessarily gone all that well, the Department of Work and Pensions and Universal Credit have gone on with the work in front of them in a sort of quiet, unsteady and methodical way. I mean, has that surprised you? You know, given all the trouble we've had getting universal credit going over a long period of time, which you've been familiar with as Secretary of State, how do you feel about its performance and the department's performance during the crisis?
Thank you, Paul. Yes, so from a technical perspective, universal credit has worked remarkably well, and given all of the horror stories that we've lived through around delayed rollout because of the technical problems behind it, I think many of us were bracing ourselves for further bad news about it. But the fact that it's handled this enormous surge in new cases, new applications for the benefit, I think speaks very well to the robustness of the system. I also think it speaks very well of Theresa Coffey, the Secretary of State, her own decision-making capabilities. She took a decision very early on to redeploy a lot of staff from the centre at the Department of Work and Pensions out to the front line to support the work coaches in managing the new claims that were coming in. So she's done her job as Secretary of State very, very well indeed. Where I think the discussion about universal credit during the pandemic has been pretty thin, actually. I don't want to go over the answer to the previous question. Don't go over those arguments again. But all of the early part of the pandemic, the focus was on the importance of furlough and furlough helping employers hang on to jobs. And that was exactly right. But what that did, I felt, was postpone a really hard, gritty discussion about the real safety net of the welfare state and the adequacy of universal credit, not from a technical perspective, but from a pure financial measure in terms of supporting households with their family incomes. And that's the discussion we had as part of the answer to the second question there. So I don't want to go over that again. But yes, you're right, Paul. It's performed remarkably well from a technical point of view. But I think if you're a family who've for want of a better phrase, middle class. You've got mortgage commitments, you've got car payments, you may even have some savings which actually prevent you from even getting universal credit altogether. You're going to find it quite a pretty hard landing moving from full employment or even furlough into relying on universal credit to keep your family going.
Okay, I think that's what politicians call a kind of advanced submission to the Chancellor, to be considered in due course. I'm going to just ask you all about some of the people who've lost their jobs just before the coronavirus kicked in, and also about young people who've had it really rough. When we were writing about this earlier in the year, we identified getting more staff into Job Centre Plus and getting them really teed up for this mass of people who'd be coming to them looking for jobs now. I remember talking to people in one of the other departments who said that they really needed also to sort of ginger up the careers service and make it easier for people who would be barred by, for one technical reason or another, for going for apprenticeships, for getting of them. I wondered how you all thought the government was doing on that. I mean, only today, Therese Coff has actually announced, if it had been before I hadn't seen it, a big increase in the number of people Job Centre Plus will be directly taking on to deal with people coming to it. So Helen, how do you think they're doing on that?
So I would say absolutely right that the universal credit and what the department has done on that has been fantastic. And as Stephen said, they really focused on just this has to work for people, and that's paid off. And I hope one of the things this may do is help to build confidence in the system and build confidence that this is actually a tool that works for people and for the state. You're right that I think one of the things I was really pleased to see at one of the initial spending rounds was the Chancellor was putting money into Job Centre Plus staff, because one thing is the work we've done with Job Centre Plus staff across the country. They are fantastic, many of them, but things like the caseloads they deal with, the number of people they are supposed to be giving personalised support to has grown and grown, and that has really reduced people's capacity to give that kind of targeted support. I think the other thing I would say is that young people obviously is a group we're worried about, but actually there are some other groups that I think are at just as much risk of long-term scarring on unemployment that we haven't yet seen that kind of targeted support for. So disabled workers and carers, we know, have been among some of the first to lose jobs and are likely to find it hard to get back in. Some Black and minority ethnic groups, again, very high risk of unemployment and often find it hard to get back into the labour market. And actually, as Jonathan was saying, older adults who don't have a lot of qualifications, often, again, they're hit as hard as young people, but we haven't yet seen tailored support. So I would like to see the department follow on from the Kickstart scheme with packages aimed at those other groups, because we need them to stay close to the labour market and to retrain to get back into work quickly. And I'm not sure we've yet seen those packages for those other groups.
You get any sense that's in the offing?
I hope so. I think part of my concern is I think there is a difference between saying we have an overall approach which is about personalisation, and that's right. But actually all the evidence suggests for some of these groups, you don't just need a general personalised service, you need specialised providers who get much better value for money. And that's particularly for disabled workers, say. So I'm not sure yet whether they are setting up enough of that specialist support which can work with the more generalised Job Centre Plus offer.
Jonathan, you were saying a few moments ago that you felt that the LEPs in your area had more to do. I mean, what do you feel about Job Centre Plus and how it's adapting to the demands that will be made on it by the coronavirus?
So I visited my local one in Kidsgrove, but there's also another one in Stoke-on-Trent, which is in a different constituency, but we're one city. And I've got to be honest, they're amazing. I mean, meeting some of the new staff that have come in and the team and the grittiness and determination. I also know about how well they've been doing because my own dad is a piano teacher, goes around to people's homes as a tutor. Well, that's been knocked out. So whilst he was waiting for the self-employed scheme, he had to go to the job centre, and they did an amazing job of guiding him through universal credit in terms of how that worked there. So I think they're doing a remarkable job. I think Helen made some really good points there about that support for the elder generation, because I think Helen will correct me if I'm wrong, and my understanding is that if those type of people in their 50s and 60s are out of work for 6 months or more, it's very rare they ever return to the labour market. Well, then that's going to be a huge cost on the welfare state further down the line, which is why absolutely we need to look at how Kickstart works for young people, and then what can we do at that elder generation, because the cost on the welfare state will be far greater than if we invest now in some measures to encourage businesses to engage and work with people who are more elderly. And Helen also raised the point about disabled, and let's be frank as well, people with learning needs. I know that in Warwickshire, where I'm from originally, Warwickshire County Council ran a scheme where they found out 75% of people with learning needs are actually able to do work. It's just that employers see it as a huge barrier because they don't know how to handle those kind of individuals. And I think something like only 5% of that workforce was actually in work. Now, what Warwickshire County Council did is supplied support for businesses to take on these type of workers and actually guide them through how to get used to dealing with someone with autism or someone with ADHD. And some of these businesses were in tears when they left and got new jobs because that young person or that elderly person had the confidence to apply for a job themselves. And that business was losing someone who they found was massively of high value in their industry. So actually we need to ensure that we're going to invest in helping and supporting business to encourage those type of individuals into the workforce. Because again, that will save, I think, something like 2 million over the lifetime of each individual to the state by having that person in a job. But again, coming back to our original discussion, is it a good quality job that will last long term? That's where then we need to have a further discussion.
Another dimension of working and home life that's been affected by COVID, been a factor in COVID, but is also a factor anyway. I wanted to ask what you all thought about childcare policy, because on the one hand, during the pandemic, it's been very plain that with kids off school, if they're younger kids, it's had a huge effect on the labour market because the parents of younger kids have to stay at home, although of course it's true with the lockdown that people's freedom to move has been restricted. I mean, nonetheless, this difficulty of accessing childcare is a kind of feature of our system anywhere, where we have a number of schemes. They're quite complicated to access. On the continent, there's a sort of, in places anyway, there's a quite sort of different tradition of sort of bigger family allowances. I wondered what you all thought about how important childcare policy was in terms of work and access to work, and what the government could do about it. Jonathan?
I think that's a really interesting point. Having just become a father of an 8-week-old, having to think about those challenges going down the line. Look, I think I'm going to kind of go back into my safety net of being a teacher, so apologies for that. But the school building is the most underutilised building in any community. Why in the summer is it shut? And why are we not using it from the local authority or government perspective? You have a building with all the safeguarding measures in place in terms of intercoms, gates, kitchens, different rooms for different age groups, outdoor, indoor space. Why are we not utilising that building much more within a community to provide after-school care? It doesn't have to be by teachers. The third sector is sitting there desperate for buildings to reduce their overheads and then invest in young people. I've got the Ymca North Staffordshire, which was voted the UK's best one in 2019. An amazing group of individuals who we're looking at getting into Kidsgrove Secondary School and thinking about what's the offer we can provide first thing in the morning, whether it be early morning breakfast clubs, whether it just be that basic childcare as parents head off to work on the early morning shifts or are returning back from a night shift, all the way through to 5-6 o'clock when parents are at work. You know, I was the beneficiary of going to a private school. School wasn't 8 till 4 for me. It was like 7 till 7. You had all the amounts of clubs available to me was an absolute godsend and a blessing to my parents, because it meant I didn't annoy them at home for as much as I normally would have been able to. And it's that type of forward thinking about how can the third sector, the local authorities, work together, but the government will need to incentivise that with some financial incentives. And I promise you now, there are teachers in abundance who will happily volunteer at least an hour, 2 hours of their time after school to share their interests and their hobbies with young people. Because I promise you now, some of the most disadvantaged kids, some of the ones that we see as the troublemakers, in inverted commas, they're the ones who are hanging around the school gates till at 6 o'clock at night because they don't want to go home because home isn't a safe place or a stable place, or it isn't a place where their parents are going to be, and they feel insecure about that. They want, to come home and see mum and dad, but mum and dad are now working jobs which require them to work till later. So that's been a huge shift, hasn't it? Let's be honest, socially, from one parent working to now both parents working full time just to make sure ends meet. So for me, using those school buildings is a huge opportunity to provide better quality childcare in a safe environment that I don't think would be a huge cost to the taxpayer.
Stephen, I don't know how much longer you can stay, but I'm going to go to you next and ask you for your thoughts on childcare policy and work.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And just very, very quickly, and then I do need to head across to the other meeting. But this is an area, and Paul and Jonathan's covered a lot of ground there, which I largely agree with. There have been improvements in childcare provision for many, many families up and down the country in recent years. Some deliberate policy choices that have been taken by a Conservative government. Also, and Jonathan's alluded to there, a whole plethora of preschool and after-school activities that have grown up, often involving food, which has helped kind of meet the need for ensuring children are getting nutritious food and also being looked after for longer than just the hours of the school day. And of course, COVID has just been hugely, hugely disruptive for all of that, and it's still having a disruptive impact. And I think the government really, rather than looking at, whether it needs to be putting more money into provision of childcare, I think the more immediate question the government's got to get a grip on is how on earth do we recreate all of these activities that many of which have fallen victim to the restrictions that we're under. It's taken a huge amount of effort to get schools up and running. Many schools are actually not even full to the usual of the usual hours of the school day. Some of them are finishing at 2:30. So how on earth do we get all of that after school provision that existed pre-COVID is a major headache for government, and that's the most immediate thing rather than kind of additional financing, I think.
That's fine.
Sorry, it's brief answer.
Then, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's been great having you and your insights. Helen, childcare.
Yes, so I think it's interesting. So we put an awful lot of public money into childcare in this country. I mean, billions. But we get remarkably, in my view, poor value for that public money. I think, as you said, Paul, we've got this patchwork of systems which are very difficult to navigate. They work in different ways. And actually the bits of the system that are for people on low incomes tend not to work very well, more so than those bits of the system that are aimed at people on higher incomes. And it's definitely a barrier to work and a barrier to being able to juggle that work and caring. So some of the biggest problems you've got that the under threes. So the childcare system for under threes doesn't really work very well. It's expensive. It's hard to get it to match atypical working hours. So people on low incomes who are working in retail, hospitality, they aren't 9-to-5 jobs. But actually very few local authority areas have enough childcare for workers doing that work. But also, although you do universal credit actually increase the amount of support you get financially for childcare, still the 15% you have to pay is still a barrier for a lot of low income parents because they're already behind with the rent, not able to pay the electric bill and so on. But also the way that system was set up was really strange because you have to pay up front and then claim it back. And that can be, as big as your rent. And low-income families just don't have that kind of cash flow. So we've talked to people who have not been able to take up jobs or have fallen out of work because the childcare support they should be getting doesn't match how you actually live. And there's kind of a sticking plaster saying DWP can use a flexible fund, but we have no idea if they're actually using it, and nobody knows outside they're supposed to be. So I do think that this is one of those areas where if you took all the public money we spent, you put it into one pot and you thought, what is the best value for this money? You wouldn't do this. And I think at some point, somebody needs to grasp it and actually say, how do we get the best value for each pound in terms of employment and children's education? And you could design a system that does that and move away from this kind of crazy patchwork of systems.
Just a quick summing up on that. I mean, Jonathan was really talking about things you could do on the supply side, like bring schools into greater use. But on this demand side, on the complexity of funding, I mean, it's an unfashionable view, but isn't the simplest way of putting money into childcare actually through the good old-fashioned medium of child benefit, which is not so fashionable these days, but it's relatively simple to claim. Everyone gets it. You're not saddled with all these issues about paying and claiming in advance. Isn't that an indispensable element in childcare policy?
I mean, I think in terms of getting money to families for lots of different things, you've got pros and cons. If you go through universal credit, it's more targeted towards the people who need it most, but there's higher barriers to get it. Child benefit does get to pretty much everybody who should get it. I think on childcare, though, when we looked at it a few years ago, the most efficient way to fund childcare, if you're going to put public money into it, is to do supply side funding. You just get better value for money. So you put money directly into providers, and they then will claim it depending on how many children they've got and so on. You tend to get more bang for your buck doing it that way, and you actually can demand things like higher quality, which feeds into educational results later. So I think that kind of shift would give you better value for money than any kind of demand side interventions.
Okay, let's move from childcare to housing. I mean, one of the big, long-standing great sort of policy issues in British public life. I mean, the coalition wrestled with this, with its northern powerhouse idea, was one, trying to get cities joined up, but it was two, trying to make it easier for people to move to where the jobs are. That's not going to be easier without more housing. The government's got a very bold plan, the centrepiece of which really is some sort of form of centralised housing target. It's pretty controversial among Conservative MPs. I mean, Jonathan, if I could just come to you first. I don't know what the housing situation is like in Stoke, whether it's an issue for you as it is in other part of the Midlands, and if so, kind of what you think about the government's proposals.
So if I'm not mistaken, I think we've delivered 8,000 homes in the last, 10 years. But I'm sure Abby Brown, the leader of the council, will clip me around the ear if I've got that stat wrong. I know we're one of the fastest house building areas outside of London. So in Stoke, we're actually in some ways a bit sad by this algorithm, because we've got a lesser housing target. We're the second poorest local authority in terms of council tax revenue in the country. So we want more housing. We've got tons of brownfield just sitting there waiting to be developed on. But because we have negative land value, that does require the government to invest in brownfield sites. So if you take the Royal Dalton, this lovely old ceramic factory that sadly closed many years ago, £10 million has meant the local authority have been able to tidy up that site, and developers then were snapping off to get an opportunity. And now we're going to have 200 plus beautiful homes with gigabit capability, but be right into them, which will revitalise places like Burslem, the mother town of Stoke-on-Trent, which has, again, sadly, the most closed high street shops of any part of the UK. So, I keep racking up my own challenges here. I shouldn't probably keep saying all this stuff. But, that kind of investment is crucial. We want more housing. Now, the affordable element is where I sort of have a slight issue, because in Stoke, to be quite frank, our housing is affordable. The average house price is £114,000 a year. I don't need affordable housing. What I need is 3-bed, 4-bed, 5-bed executive homes with double garages that can be a commuter belt for Manchester in the north of the city where I represent, to encourage those higher wealth individuals into the area and therefore bring economic regeneration with it as well. I also want to see the infrastructure levy is the one thing that I am slightly concerned about, because again, it's the negative land value. The infrastructure levy is all about the idea that you will get money based on how much the value of the land has increased since the development's happened. That's lovely. So if I've got a property, the land value of minus 100,000, and the developer then makes it worth zero now, that land, because they've developed it, that means we get zero? If it means a minus 10,000 now, does that mean the local authority earns the developer money? So, we earn about 3 million a year in Section 106. And so I want to make sure the infrastructure levy will work for places like Stoke, where negative land value is a problem. Because if we don't get that infrastructure levy, and by the way, less than 90% of parents in my patch get their first choice secondary school. So I need that infrastructure to build more schools, to build up the capacity of local health practitioners, and to obviously invest into youth facilities or job opportunities in the local area by improving the roads, by improving public transport, which, as we know, sadly, in places like Stoke, saw further reductions from beachings, unlike most areas. So I love the ambition. I'm fully supportive of what we're wanting to do, which is shake up the housing system. What we need to do is make sure we target in the right way into each area, not just go, oh, well, if this works for the South East, it'll work for Stoke, because that's simply not the case.
Helen, what do you think on the housing issue?
I think we definitely need to intervene and to get the housing market fixed. The biggest gap so far is I'm really surprised to have seen nothing on investing more in social housing. When you've got this really urgent need, that you've got lots and lots of people on low incomes crowded into the private rented sector, where they aren't able to keep up with the rent, they're building up debt, often it's pretty insecure, it's not very good quality. And actually that's unbalancing everything else, and that's what's driving the housing benefit bill, which we know is a real concern. There's a kind of the economic case for investing in social housing is cold. You can get the money back over years because of what you'll save on housing benefit. But actually, we know one of the big concerns for the party, for the public, is homelessness. The biggest thing driving homelessness in the last few years has been the lack of low-cost rented homes. So that's what we're really hoping to see this autumn, is the Chancellor invest in social housing, both rented and shared ownership and so on, alongside some of these other things, because that's how you get a balanced housing market, and you can get something that people can just access a safe, secure home, which doesn't eat away all of the pay rises they might be getting from the national living wage, for instance, which is what's been happening in recent years.
A question from, I'm going to move to questions from those who are following this event. Now, I've got a question from Tess Godley, which is this: the UK's 100,000 social enterprises have an impressive track record on creating jobs, especially for the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged places. What are the panel's thoughts on government support for business models that are focused on both financial and social return? Helen.
So I think what I would like to see is that where the government is offering support for businesses, whatever kind of business that is, that comes with proportionate strings attached in terms of quality. So it's happening quite a lot on a city level, where you have a kind of brochure, you have options of how you create good quality jobs. So, paying the real living wage if you can, offering secure contracts, investing in training, there's a whole range of things. And if we're going to put public money into supporting businesses, they should also be willing to sign up to some of those, and the amount they have to sign up to depends on the amount of support they're getting. So I think my focus would be less on picking which kind of businesses that we might like or dislike, and just saying whatever kind of business you are, we want to support you, we want to create jobs, but we want you, if you're going to get public support, to create good quality jobs, which is actually better for business anyway.
And Jonathan, what do you think about government support for business models focused on social and financial return?
I like a lot what Helen had to say, really. So I feel like any chance of having a say, my thunder got stolen if I could be cheeky enough, Helen, to say that. I think that, for example, in Stoke, one of our biggest employers is the Bet365. Now, it's a gambling company, like Helen would say. To us in Westminster, people get very angsty about the idea of why would we promote them? But actually, no one talks about the millions they invest into the local community through the charitable donations they give, or through upskilling and employing local people. So I absolutely agree that there needs to be incentives as to how, when you're taking local people, what are you doing with them? Is there upskilling? Is there, links to training into other sectors, that into the business maybe, that ultimately where their job currently is going to be automated in the future? That I think there's got to be that sensible conversation. Like Helen said, when government taxpayers' money is being used to support business, then the taxpayer must see a return on that investment. And that means, and look, I won't say I'm a pro-business Tory, but businesses also have to be responsible to their local community. And so I expect that, to them to take it very seriously. I think one of the things we learned from 2008 is we helped out the banks, but have the banks helped us out in this crisis as much as they should? it took an awful lot of the Chancellor being in the ear of these banks over the bounce back loans, over the business interruption loan, to ensure that they weren't just taking advantage of people as they were going and trying to slap high interest rates on them. I would expect corporations to be much more responsible than that. And I'm very lucky that I've got a very sort of community-centred business. If I look at Synetic Solutions in Burslem, who are actually working with the Cabinet on making sure that there's no fraud currently going on, or trying to stop the fraud from happening on these loan schemes. They have provided, with Port Vale Football Club, 150,000 meals across the community in this crisis. They are committed to trying to install a mentoring scheme for young people in the city so they can see what it's like to have a Stokey go from, the school there into a business in Burslem that's now making them 40, 50,000 plus pounds a year. It's that, and therefore what that unlocks in terms of homes, in terms of holidays, in terms of standard of living. So I think that's a really positive step forward. And I agree with Helen, the businesses taking taxpayers' money must give back into those taxpayers who have helped them.
Question from Emily Wallace. Where should responsibility for retraining and reskilling fall? Can government support employers to take some responsibility for helping staff to retrain for their local labour market before they make them redundant? Jonathan, any thoughts on that?
Look, I was really pleased that we heard the apprenticeship levy is going to be reviewed and how it works. I don't think it currently works as well as it should do, especially for SMEs. Look, in Stoke and Staffordshire, you've got 31,500 micro and small businesses. That's 97% of all our businesses. I don't think apprenticeships have worked well for those type of companies at this moment in time. I think the government has to, therefore, incentivise business in these early stages by offering, whether it be tax breaks, whether it be financial incentives to fund maybe national insurance contributions or pension contributions, take some of that financial pressure off, because we are a country of SMEs, really. Was it well over 50% of our economy is on small and medium-sized businesses. Taking on apprenticeships is a cost and is a time that maybe that business doesn't easily have. So therefore, giving money to colleges to better and to expand their role, maybe having apprenticeship managers engaging with those businesses and hand-holding business through with a young person or that older person in the job that they're in, but also saying to business that if you do this for us, this is what you can get back in return. Businesses want new people coming through all the time. They want new ideas and fresh thinking. They want people, especially from the local community, who are going to better connect them to the local area. So whilst, again, I don't like mass state interventionism, I think that until we create a mindset amongst the business community of that's a responsibility, we're going to never see an end to this. We're going to have to intervene in the short term at least.
Helen, responsibility for reskilling, where should it fall?
So I think it has to be shared. I think that it's partly down to individuals, but I also think that Emily's right. We need to be incentivising businesses to invest in people. And that's one of the things when we've looked at why our productivity is worse than some other European countries, particularly in some of our low-pay sectors. One of the factors is our employers are not investing in their staff, particularly low-paid staff, to the same degree as they do elsewhere. So one of the things that we've explored, for instance, is an in-work training tax credit. So we incentivise businesses to invest in R&D. Why don't we incentivise them to invest in their people as well? I also think that we need to get the kind of funding model right. So at the moment, you've got at least 3 different budgets for adult education across England. That makes no sense. We should put them all together into one budget that's streamlined, and we should then devolve that down to mayoral combined authorities so that they can use it in a tailored way for their local labour markets. And I think there needs to be a kind of give and take with business. So I think that it is right for the state to say, okay, we have this funding pot and we want to use that to help you. So businesses can identify skill shortages, we can identify the sectors that really want to grow, and we can invest in tailored training. The flip side is that businesses then accept they'll work with, say, a provider and create a pipeline for those people locally who are out of work or stuck in low-paid jobs, so that when we do invest in a place, the people in that place actually see it transform their prospects, rather than just we invest, local people carry on doing not very good jobs, but they have a shiny new train station or whatever it is that's been built. So I think we need to make that a partnership. It shouldn't just be the state, it should be business too, but it needs to happen at that local level to actually have impact for the people in those places.
Okay, I've been told we've got some 5 minutes left, so I'm going to just try and sort of ask a last question to just sum it all up. A lot of the discussion this afternoon has been about the quality of jobs as well as the quantity, about trying to provide more quality jobs and get people who don't necessarily have them or are a long way from the labour market anyway into them. I mean, how confident can we feel that the government's going to be able to deal with this, that it's going to be able to level up, given the rise in unemployment we're going to get from COVID and the uncertain economic situation ahead, because the sheer need to provide jobs at all may drive out some of the work that one would like to do to ensure the jobs are quality jobs. Helen?
Well, I think the main thing is we have tried it that way before. So after the last recession, we had quite a conscious decision to focus on quantity, not quality of jobs. And so we've tried it in practice. And what that led to was rising poverty among workers. But actually what it also created was this lost decade of stagnant pay growth, of poor productivity, and of places in the UK falling further behind. So I think we've actually done that. So I don't think we should do it again and discover we have another lost decade. I think what we've already seen is that if you can keep the quality up, then you can actually create a much stronger recovery. And that is what will set us on the right course for people and communities. It's also what will let us get the public finances sorted out. You can only do that if you get back to real economic growth. And actually that poor quality jobs recovery doesn't lead to good economic growth.
Jonathan, how do you feel about levelling up, looking ahead as someone who was recently elected? You've got an election coming down the road. Levelling up is the big theme. What's it all look like to you?
Levelling up to me is, I think education is first. We all know the biggest drive for improving social mobility is educational outcomes. But then what you need to do is have the educational destinations. And that's the challenge, not just being university focused, but having a mixture of university and further education, which I'm delighted the government is changing the focus from. What we now need to see is sort of more detail behind that. How's that going to look? How's that going to work? How's it going to be financed? I firmly believe in this Prime Minister's fully committed to levelling up. I looked him in the eyes only a week ago and said to him, will we be able to deliver on levelling up even after this economic hit? And I tell you now, a bang on the table and a big stare in my direction, pointing the finger saying we absolutely will, means I believe he is fully committed to that. I suppose in my area, levelling up therefore by improving education means you can improve the jobs, which means wages will go up, and therefore we improve people's cost of living, which is a huge thing that comes up in Stoke-on-Trent every single time. It also means better connectivity to improve productivity. So actually having a bus service that works for people and is affordable, having trains brought back into my local area, like the Stoke to Leek line, would be a huge way of unlocking North Staffordshire and potentially building a tram service going forward. And then finally making sure that when we look at those jobs, like Helen said, what are they? Well, Silicon Stoke, that sounds a gimmick, but we're the only gigabit city in the country. If you can create a full fibre academy where we train 100, 200 young people into installation and engineering, those jobs are going to be long-term jobs for the future, and that will therefore start to see a jobs revolution. If we incentivise the video games industry to set up in Stoke, which will benefit from the gigabits, by maybe giving some tax reliefs or a video games investment fund. So those young graduates who leave Staffordshire University actually stay in Stoke-on-Trent and don't go to London, Manchester or Birmingham. It's that type of thing about making sure that people have an opportunity to access things they've never seen, but they only see on TV in Birmingham or Manchester. Stoke has been squeezed for a long time by these combined authorities. And that's a big issue that we're going to have to talk about in Stoke. And Staffordshire-wide, do we go for a combined authority model? In Stoke, we sacked through a referendum, our elected mayor in the past. Newcastle, 100 years ago, Newcastle Lyme, had the House of Lords block the merger of Newcastle and Stoke-on-Trent. So that old division still exists there. Trying to break down that social idea of actually we're better working together, and therefore we'll get a bigger pot of money that we can invest in a local way through local leaders with a local plan is a much better thing, I agree with Helen, than actually having someone in Whitehall who doesn't understand what Stoke-on-Trent is or how it works, trying to dictate where they think money should best be spent.
Okay, Jonathan, I'd like to thank you very much. And in closing, thank all our panellists, Helen, you and Stephen Crabb, really particularly for standing in after the Minister had to go to the Commons. I'd also like to thank publicly the Joseph Rowntree Foundation for cooperating with us in this event. Thank you all for watching. This event will be later on YouTube for those who haven't watched it or want to suggest someone else in their family or their friends might. And next at 5 o'clock, we have Wallace interviewing Wallace. So let me make sure I get this right. It will be Mark Wallace of Conservative Home interviewing Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, not, I think, the other way round. Do join us again at 5 o'clock. Thank you all very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, John.